The notification arrived on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that starts gray and stays that way, where the light never quite commits to arriving fully, and the air outside carries that particular damp stillness that settles into old neighborhoods and old grief with equal comfort. Elena Voss was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing a coffee mug that had already been clean, when her phone buzzed against the countertop. She had developed the habit of rinsing things that didn't need rinsing. It gave her hand something to do during the hours she could not afford to stop moving, because when she stopped moving, she thought about the numbers. And when she thought about the numbers, the tightness in her chest returned. And when the tightness returned, it was harder to get Mia ready for school on time. She picked up the phone with wet fingers and read the message from her aunt. It was not long. Her father's estate attorney had finalized the inventory. They needed her at the house by Saturday to oversee the removal of the remaining contents. The estate had been in a holding pattern for 6 weeks, ever since her father, Harold Voss, had passed quietly in his sleep on a February night that felt, in Elena's memory, like it had happened both very recently and very long ago. The phone went face down on the counter. She stood there a moment longer, listening to the sound of the upstairs hallway, where Mia was beginning her slow, unpredictable morning routine of finding mismatched socks and asking questions about the nature of clouds. Elena was 34 years old. She had a daughter who was 7, was a part-time administrative job at a veterinary clinic that paid slightly less than her monthly expenses required, and a 1-bedroom apartment in a building where the elevator had been broken since October. She had none of these things by design. Life had arranged them for her through a series of small collapses rather than one large one, each manageable on its own, each compounding quietly until the total weight became something she carried in her jaw and her shoulders without quite realizing how much she had taken on. Her marriage had ended not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a long, mutual withdrawal. 2 people deciding separately, over many months, that the effort of staying was costing more than either of them had left to spend. Her ex-husband, Daniel, was not a bad man. He was simply a man who had found, over time, that he was better suited to a life Elena could not follow him into. He paid his support on time. He called Mia on Sundays. Elena did not think about him more than she had to. Her father's death had caught her at the worst possible moment financially, which was also the only kind of moment she seemed to have anymore. She had taken 3 days off work for the funeral, which meant 3 days without pay, which meant the utilities bill sat another week without being opened, because opening it required math she did not have the emotional bandwidth for. She had not told anyone this. She had arrived at the funeral home in the same black dress she had worn to her college graduation, because it was the only black dress she owned that still fit. And she had held Mia's hand throughout the service and received the condolences of relatives she barely recognized, and said thank you each time in a voice that sounded, even to her, like someone else's. Her father had been a quiet man, not cold, but contained, the kind of person who expressed affection through proximity rather than declaration. He would appear in the kitchen when she was doing homework, not to help, not to supervise, but simply to be in the same room, drinking tea and reading without speaking. She had understood, even as a child, that this was his way of saying he was there. After her mother left when Elena was 11, the quiet between them had deepened from comfortable to necessary. They had not talked about it. Not really. Not the way the books said you should. They had simply continued. He had made dinner. She had made it to school. Years passed in that reliable, unspoken way. He had lived alone in the same house for the last 18 years, a narrow 2-story on a street that had once been modest and was now being slowly transformed by people who used words like potential and bones when describing properties that had been someone else's ordinary life. The house was not remarkable from the outside. Its paint had faded from white to the color of old paper. The front garden had gone wild in the agreeable, unplanned way that gardens do when left to themselves, and the gutters had a particular angle that suggested a meaningful conversation with a ladder had been deferred for several years. But it was real in the way that houses inhabited by one person for a very long time become real. Every surface had absorbed something of him. The kitchen still smelled of the particular tea he drank, a loose-leaf blend from a small shop downtown that had since closed. The hallway had a groove worn into the floorboards from the path between his bedroom and the bathroom, a testimony in wood to 18 years of insomnia and middle-of-the-night walks. And in the back room, the one he had always called the study, though it was less study than sanctuary, there stood the record cabinet. Elena had not been in that room since before he died. She had not been ready. She knew this about herself without judgment. She had a list of things she wasn't ready for, and she tended to them in sequence rather than all at once, which was the only sustainable approach she had discovered. But Saturday was coming, and with it, the arrival of her Aunt Patricia and her cousin Derek and the estate attorney's assistant, who had emailed twice already with a subject line that read, "Action required," in capitals that felt mildly aggressive under the circumstances. And so Elena had to be ready, or at least functional, which was the version of ready she had been practicing. She told Mia on the drive to school that they were going to Grandpa Harold's house on Saturday to help sort through some of his things. Mia, who was 7, and therefore operated with a 7-year-old's philosophical pragmatism about matters she could not change, asked whether she could bring her drawing book. Elena said yes. She asked whether Grandpa Harold had a garden with bugs. Elena said yes to that too. Mia appeared satisfied and spent the rest of the drive narrating a story she was inventing about a caterpillar who wanted to become a detective instead of a butterfly, which Elena listened to with the particular tender attention of a mother who knows that such stories are precious precisely because they are temporary. On Friday evening, after Mia was asleep, Elena sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet under the sink. This was a habit she had developed during the marriage and kept afterward, sitting on kitchen floors when things felt too large for chairs. She held a glass of water and thought about her father's house. She thought about the record cabinet specifically, which had occupied the left wall of the back room for as long as she could remember. It was tall, dark-stained oak, with a lower cabinet section of solid double doors and an upper section of glass-fronted shelves in which he kept his vinyl records standing upright in alphabetical order. The lower section she had never fully explored as a child. Her father kept it shut. Not locked, never locked, but closed in a way that communicated it contained things that were his to keep. She had respected this without needing to be told. She remembered coming home from school on winter afternoons when she was 12 or 13 and finding the house warm and the sound of music drifting from the back room, something slow and orchestral, or occasionally jazz, the kind with a lot of space between notes. She would stand in the hallway and listen before going in. He would be seated in the old green armchair with a book open in his lap and the record turning, and he would look up when she entered with that particular expression of his, not quite a smile but close, the one that said he was glad she was there without making a performance of it. They would sit together in the comfortable silence he specialized in while the record played, and it was during those hours, more than any other she could name, that she had felt most securely herself. The estate attorney had listed the record cabinet in the inventory as item 47. Wooden record storage unit, contents included, estimated resale value negligible. Her Aunt Patricia had sent a follow-up email that Elena had read 3 times. It said, in Patricia's characteristically practical way, that the cabinet was too large to move intact, that the records themselves were decades old and unlikely to hold any significant value, and that the most efficient course of action would be to donate the records in bulk and have the cabinet broken down for disposal. She had added, with what Elena recognized as genuine kindness beneath the practicality, that she understood it was sentimental, but that holding on to large pieces of furniture was not always the best way to process grief, and that photographs of the items could serve the same emotional purpose without the logistical burden. Elena had not responded to that email, not because she was angry, but because she did not know what to say. What she felt about the record cabinet was not something she could reduce to an email. It was not simply sentiment, though that was part of it. It was something more structural, something about the way the cabinet had occupied the same wall for her entire life, or about the way her father had maintained it with a kind of quiet devotion that he did not apply to anything else in the house. The records were alphabetized and sleeved. The glass was cleaned regularly. The wood was oiled once a year, a task she had watched him perform from the doorway on 2 separate occasions, using a cloth and a tin of beeswax that smelled warm and particular. He had not done this out of obsession. He had done it out of respect, which was a different thing entirely. Saturday arrived with the particular quality of mornings that have weight before they begin. The sky was low and white when Elena loaded Mia into the car at 8 o'clock. Mia carrying her drawing book and wearing a coat with a missing button that Elena had been meaning to sew back on for 2 weeks. The drive to her father's house took 20 minutes, and Elena spent most of it in a state of careful blankness, the way you drive when you need to arrive somewhere you are not sure you can walk into. Patricia's car was already in the driveway. Beside it was a second vehicle Elena did not recognize, a white sedan that likely belonged to the estate attorney's representative. She sat in her own car for a moment after turning off the engine. Mia was already unbuckled and pressing her face to the window at the prospect of the garden. Inside, the house smelled of absence in that specific way that the recently vacated homes of people who lived alone tend to smell, not of decay, but of the end of a presence, air that no longer moved in the patterns of a life. Patricia was in the kitchen with a notepad, moving efficiently between cabinets. So she was a trim woman in her early 60s, with her hair cut short and a manner that communicated she had decided early in life that competence was its own form of kindness. She came forward when Elena entered and held her hands briefly. "Your father kept things orderly. That makes this easier," she said, which was true and also typical of Patricia, who processed grief by finding its most manageable angle. Derek was in the living room with a roll of packing tape, dismantling a bookshelf with the focused indifference of a man who preferred tasks to conversations. He nodded at Elena when she came in. He was 41, the kind of person who had always been slightly too old for his age, and he had never quite known what to do with Elena, nor she with him. They had managed a kind of distant cordiality for most of their lives that functioned well enough at funerals and holiday dinners. The estate attorney's representative introduced herself as Ms. Feld, a young woman with a tablet and a manner of polite efficiency that suggested she had spent enough time in houses like this one that she had developed professional equanimity around the artifacts of other people's lives. She had a clipboard in addition to the tablet, which Elena found oddly reassuring. She went over the main items to be cataloged, appraised, or disposed of, and Elena listened and nodded and did not mention the record cabinet until Ms. Feld reached item 47. "We'd recommend donation or disposal for the records themselves," Ms. Feld said. "There are bulk vinyl donation services, or we can arrange removal with the other furniture. The cabinet itself, given its size and condition, would likely cost more to move than its resale value would justify." "I'll keep the cabinet," Elena said. Patricia looked up from her notepad. "Elena, it's a very large piece. Your apartment doesn't have space for something that size. You said yourself last week the living room is already—" "I'll keep the cabinet," Elena said again, not forcefully, but with a finality that closed the subject the way a door closes, not slammed, simply pulled shut. There was a brief silence. Ms. Feld made a note. Patricia returned to her notepad. Derek, from the living room, said nothing, which was his default contribution. Elena left them to their cataloging and took Mia's hand and walked to the back of the house. The back room had not changed. This was the first thing she noticed, that nothing had been moved, nothing had been touched since before he died, and the stillness in it had a preserved quality, like a photograph of a life still in progress. The green armchair was still angled toward the window. The side table beside it still held his reading glasses and a book she did not recognize, its cover worn soft at the corners. The low lamp in the corner threw a yellow circle of light over everything, even in the gray morning, and the smell of the room, beeswax and old paper, and something particular and indefinite that was simply him, hit her with an unexpected force that made her stand very still in the doorway for a moment. Mia moved past her without hesitation and went to the window to look at the garden, pressing both hands flat against the glass. "Grandpa Harold's garden has so many weeds," she said cheerfully. "I bet there are a lot of bugs in there." Elena let out a breath she had been holding since the driveway. "Probably," she said. She turned to the record cabinet. Up close, it was larger than she had remembered, or perhaps everything had been larger when she was small, and she had simply not readjusted the scale. The upper glass section held perhaps 200 records, maybe more, arranged in their neat alphabetical rows, the spines facing outward in their paper sleeves, some with handwritten labels and some with printed ones, the oldest with the particular faded clarity of things printed before fonts became digital. She ran her fingers along the glass without touching it, reading names at random. Miles Davis, Beethoven, Billie Holiday, Duke Ellington, Glenn Miller. She found herself surprised by the breadth of it. She had known her father listened to records, but she had not known how many, how varied, how deliberately assembled over how many years. She crouched down in front of the lower cabinet. The double doors were the same dark oak as the rest of the piece, fitted with small brass handles that had gone slightly greenish at the edges from age. She had never opened these doors as a child. Now, with her hand on the left handle, she was aware of the weight of that restraint, the years of not looking, all of it compressed into the space between her palm and the brass. She pulled the doors open. Inside, the lower cabinet was not a simple storage space. It was divided into two sections by a vertical wooden partition, the left side holding a record player of the kind that was built into a wooden housing, portable but substantial, its lid closed and latched. On the right side were stacked boxes of varying sizes, some cardboard, some wooden, arranged with the same meticulous orderliness he had applied to everything else. The cardboard boxes were labeled in his handwriting, small and precise. Service records, tax documents, 1978 to 1995. Correspondence, letters, personal. Elena reached for the box labeled letters, personal, and held it without opening it. It was light, lighter than she expected. She set it carefully on the floor beside her. She went through the other boxes methodically, not reading their contents, but inventorying them with her eyes. Most contained what their labels promised: documents, records, the administrative sediment of a life responsibly lived. One unlabeled wooden box contained a collection of small objects she did not immediately recognize: river stones, a foreign coin, a small brass compass, a folded piece of paper that she did not unfold. Things he had carried or kept for reasons she would never know. She was about to close the lower cabinet again when something caught her eye. At the very back of the right section, partially obscured by the stacked boxes and the deep shadow of the interior, the back wall of the cabinet did not look like wood. She leaned in closer, tilting her head. The rest of the cabinet's interior was plain, unpainted oak, the same grain she had been running her fingers along all morning. But the back wall, in this particular angle of the light that fell in from the open doors, had a different quality, slightly different in color, slightly different in surface texture. She could not have described it precisely, only that something about it wasn't the same as everything else. She removed the stacked boxes from the right side one by one, setting them on the floor beside her until the back wall was fully visible. She leaned in until her face was near the interior. The back panel was darker than the sides, but it was the texture that was different. The side walls had the visible grain of solid oak, long parallel lines running vertically with natural variation in spacing and shade. The back panel's grain was too regular, too uniform, the difference between a natural thing and a fabricated impression of a natural thing. She pressed her palm flat against it and heard, beneath the contact, a sound that was different from the sound the sides made. Not hollow exactly, but not solid in the same way. The density was wrong. Elena sat back on her heels and looked at the cabinet for a long moment. Then she looked around the room. Then at Mia, who was now crouched in the corner near the bookshelf, investigating a spider with quiet scientific interest and narrating the encounter in a low voice to herself. She pressed the back panel again, more deliberately this time, moving her palm in a slow grid across its surface, listening. The difference in resonance was subtle but consistent. The panel was not the original back wall of the cabinet. It was something added, something placed there intentionally, fitted with sufficient precision that it would only betray itself to someone looking from the inside at close range, or in the right quality of light, with enough patience to notice what was wrong. Her father had been a quiet man who expressed things through proximity and care rather than declaration. He had oiled this cabinet's wood once a year for 2 decades. He had kept its interior organized and labeled. He had never, as far as Elena could recall, mentioned anything about it beyond the records it held. She pressed harder on the lower right corner of the panel, a habit from childhood, when she had discovered that the cabinet in her school library had a release point at its lower corner if you pushed in the right place. Nothing happened. She tried the center. Nothing. She tried the upper left, and then the upper right, and then, almost as an afterthought, the lower left. And on the lower left, she felt something give, not a dramatic release. So not a spring mechanism or a catch clicking open, but a very small, very deliberate shift of pressure, the way a well-made thing yields when it has finally been asked correctly. The panel moved inward approximately an inch, and then stopped. Elena stared at the gap it had created along the left side. Behind the panel, in the space between the false back and the true back of the cabinet, was darkness. She pulled her phone from her pocket and activated the flashlight and directed it into the gap. She could not yet see clearly. The panel had moved inward, but not opened. It was hinged on the right, and the gap was only on the left. And to see what was behind it, she would need to open it further. She worked her fingers into the gap and pulled gently, feeling resistance, not of a lock, but of a thing that had not been opened in a long time. And she applied steady pressure, the way you open a jar whose seal has set, and gradually, with a dry, low sound, like the clearing of an old throat, the panel swung inward. The light from her phone fell into the space behind it. She went still. The space was approximately 8 inches deep, running the full width and height of the lower cabinet's interior, and it was not empty. On a shallow wooden shelf that had been built to exactly fit the space, arranged in 2 careful rows, with a precision that told her everything about the man who had placed them there, were documents and packages. Some were sealed in clear plastic sleeves of the kind used for archival preservation. Some were in thick envelopes, the paper yellow at the edges and soft with age. Some were in narrow wooden frames that held what appeared to be certificates, their surfaces covered in text too small to read at this distance and in this light. She counted without meaning to, 11 plastic-sleeved documents, 7 envelopes, 4 framed items. And in the far right corner of the shelf, a small, dark metal box, the kind with a lid that closes on a friction hinge, approximately the size of a hardcover novel, its surface scratched in the particular way metal scratches when it has been handled many times over many years. Elena sat back. Her heartbeat was not racing exactly, but it was different from a moment ago, carrying a quality of altered weight. She was aware of the silence of the room around her, of Mia's quiet ongoing narration in the corner, of the sounds of Patricia and Derek and Ms. Feld moving through the rest of the house with their clipboard and their tape and their competent and reasonable assessments of what was worth keeping and what was not. She looked at the cabinet, at the open panel, at the documents arranged inside it with the same meticulous care her father had applied to the records and the labels and the beeswax and the alphabetized rows. A man who did not do things casually had created this hidden shelf. A man who measured the worth of things by the attention he gave them had placed these items behind a false panel and built a release mechanism into the lower left corner and kept the whole assembly invisible for at least 18 years in a house where his only daughter came and sat with him on winter afternoons and listened to records and felt most completely herself. And he had never said a word. She reached into the space and took out the small metal box first, because it was the only thing without an obvious category, the thing that did not announce itself with a plastic sleeve or a label or a frame. It was heavier than she expected. She turned it over in her hands. There was no label on it. The lid was smooth except for one small spot near the hinge where someone had scratched a mark into the metal, not decoratively, but precisely, the way you mark something to ensure you always open it the right way first. She opened it. Inside, resting on a layer of dark felt that had been cut to fit the interior, was a key. Not a house key, not a safety deposit box key of the small, flat variety, but a substantial key of the kind used in older-style security systems, with a wide bow and a blade with complex warding, the kind of thing that went with a lock built to last. Beside the key, folded to a square and then folded again, was a single sheet of paper. The paper was not old. The fold marks were still relatively crisp, the kind of crisp that suggests 5 years rather than 20, and the handwriting on the outside of the fold was her father's, unmistakably his, the same small, precise hand that had labeled every box in the lower cabinet, every record spine in the upper section, every document in his files. The outside of the folded sheet said one word: Elena. She sat very still in the light of the back room of her father's house, with his key in her hand and her name in his handwriting on a folded piece of paper that had been waiting inside a hidden shelf behind a false panel in a cabinet he had told her to keep. And she was aware of several things simultaneously. So she was aware that her daughter was in the corner asking the spider whether it preferred flies or mosquitoes. She was aware that Patricia would come looking for her within the next 30 minutes. She was aware that the estate attorney's representative had a tablet and a clipboard and an efficient manner, and the specific task of cataloging things as negligible or otherwise. She was aware that her father had been a quiet man who expressed things through proximity and care, and that he had left her a key and her name on a piece of paper, and that he had done so in a place that only she would have thought to look, or rather, in a place that only she would have had reason to look, because she was the one who had refused to throw the cabinet away. She unfolded the paper with hands that were completely steady, because she was that kind of person when it mattered, steady when things were large and trembling only when they were small. The note was not long. Her father had never used more words than necessary. The handwriting was clear and unhurried, written by someone who had thought about what to say for a long time before sitting down to write it. It said, If you are reading this, then you did not listen to anyone who told you to throw it away. I knew you wouldn't. There are things I should have told you while I still could. I did not know how. What is behind this panel is the beginning of the answer. The key goes to the unit at Brentwood Self-Storage, Building C, Bay 14. Go alone first. Take your time. Some things were meant to be understood before they are shared. I have been very proud of you for a long time. I didn't say it enough, so I'm saying it now. Below the text, he had signed it the way he signed everything, not with affection or formality, but with his name, simply and plainly. Harold. Elena read the note twice. Then she folded it back along its existing creases and placed it in her pocket. She placed the key beside it. She began, carefully and methodically, to remove the documents from the hidden shelf one by one, turning each one over in her hands, examining their surfaces without opening the sealed ones, reading the visible text on the framed certificates. She could not yet read the certificates fully in this light, but she could see that they were not ordinary documents. The letterheads and stamps and signatures visible through the glass had a formal institutional weight to them, of the kind that accrued to legal instruments and financial instruments, and things that had been signed in the presence of witnesses. She was returning the last document to the shelf, planning her next move, when she heard Patricia's footsteps in the hallway. She closed the false panel. She closed the lower cabinet doors. She gathered the boxes she had removed from the right side and stacked them naturally to one side, as if she had simply been looking through them. When Patricia appeared in the doorway, Elena was crouched on the floor with an unlabeled wooden box in her hands, examining its contents with an expression of calm concentration. "Find anything interesting?" Patricia asked, and her voice carried genuine warmth beneath the practicality. "Some personal things," Elena said. "Letters, old documents. I'll go through them myself." Patricia nodded, accepting this, because it was reasonable, and because she had her own grief to manage, and because she trusted that Elena was, as she had always been, capable of handling what was hers. "Of course. Take your time." She left. Elena listened to her footsteps recede toward the kitchen. Mia appeared at her shoulder. "Did you find something, Mom?" Elena looked at her daughter's face, bright and open and entirely uncomplicated in the way of 7-year-old faces that have not yet learned to guard themselves against the weight of things. "I found something your grandfather left for me," Elena said. "What is it?" "I'm not sure yet, but I think it's important." Maya considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Is it a treasure?" Elena looked at the cabinet, at the closed lower doors, at the room that smelled of him still, beeswax and old paper, and the particular indefinite quality of a life responsibly kept. She thought about the key in her pocket, and the address written on the folded paper, and the 11 plastic-sleeved documents arranged in a row on a shelf that no one but her father had touched in at least 18 years. She thought about the fact that 3 people in the next room had assessed this cabinet and found its value negligible, and that she had said, "I'll keep the cabinet with a finality that closed the subject the way a door closes, simply pulled shut." "Maybe," she said, "I'm going to go find out." The drive to Brentwood Self-Storage took her away from the house and away from Patricia and Derek and Ms. Feld, with a thin, invented excuse about checking on something her father had mentioned, and she drove the whole way with one hand on the wheel and the other over her jacket pocket, where the key and the folded note sat together against her ribs. Mia had been left in the garden with explicit permission to investigate the weeds and a promise that they would stop for lunch on the way home. Patricia had accepted Elena's departure with a slight narrowing of her eyes that suggested she had noted something but filed it away rather than pursuing it, which was Patricia's particular skill, and Elena had counted on it. Brentwood Self-Storage was a low-concrete complex set back from the road behind a chain-link fence with a keypad gate, the kind of facility that existed in every city's industrial margin, functional and anonymous, designed to hold the overflow of lives without judgment. Elena keyed in the access code that had been posted on a laminated card taped to the inside of the lower cabinet door, which she had found only on her third, careful inspection of the interior before leaving the house. Her father had thought of everything. He had been that kind of person. The gate opened with the resigned efficiency of a mechanism asked to perform the same task 10,000 times. Building C was in the back of the complex, the furthest from the road. Bay 14 was in the middle of the building, a standard roll-up metal door with a heavy-duty padlock of the kind that matched the key's weight and complexity. Elena stood in front of it for a moment with the key in her hand. The concrete smelled of dust and enclosed air and the faint chemical ghost of packing materials. For a fan somewhere in the building hummed at a low, steady frequency. Somewhere outside, a truck was reversing with rhythmic warning sounds that faded as it moved away. She put the key in the lock. It turned with the clean authority of precision engineering, a sound like one clear note. The lock released. She pulled it free, looped it through her fingers, and crouched to take hold of the door's handle. She rolled the door up. The unit was a standard 10 by 10, the same compressed darkness as every storage unit everywhere. But the first thing her flashlight fell on was not disorder or random accumulation. The unit had been arranged, not like a warehouse, not like a storage space, but like an archive, with deliberate intent and careful stewardship. Metal shelving units ran along both side walls and the back wall, floor to ceiling, and on every shelf were boxes, files, and containers, each labeled in her father's small, precise hand. The labels were not general. They were specific and dated, the kind of labeling that indicated not hoarding, but documentation, a sustained, methodical record of something that had been accumulated over a very long time, with a very clear purpose. Elena stepped inside. The air was cool and still, the temperature maintained by a climate control unit mounted near the ceiling that whispered steadily to itself. She moved her flashlight slowly across the shelves. She read labels at random, and as she read them, something began to resolve in the beam of her light, a shape emerging from the specific and the particular, the way certain pictures only reveal their subject when you step back far enough to take the whole of them in at once. The labels described not one thing, but many: securities, holdings, certificates, correspondence, valuations, deeds. But the specific names and institutions recurred with a frequency that began to form a pattern. An investment account at a private Swiss firm. Correspondence with a legal trust in the Cayman Islands. Certificates of ownership for commodity holdings. Letters from auction houses in London and Geneva, bearing names Elena recognized from newspaper articles about rare art and rare instruments and rare manuscript collections. Transaction records, appraisals. Correspondence addressed not to Harold Voss, but to a different name she did not immediately recognize, H.V. Holdings, signed in her father's hand. She stood in the middle of the unit with the flashlight moving from shelf to shelf and felt something shift inside her, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, the way the ground shifts under a slow tide. The quiet man in the green armchair, the house that smelled of beeswax and old tea. The record cabinet oiled once a year with deliberate care. The note that said some things were meant to be understood before they are shared. She had thought all her life that she knew who her father was. She had thought she understood the shape of his life, modest and contained and quietly devoted, a life lived below the threshold of notice because he preferred it that way. She had not been wrong about his character, but she had, it was becoming clear, entirely misunderstood the size of what he had been, quietly, patiently. building in the years she had been living her own life at a careful distance from understanding. She pulled the nearest box from the shelf and opened it. She took out the first document and read it in the light of her phone. Then she read it again. Then she set it down very carefully on the floor of the storage unit and sat beside it and looked at the walls of shelves around her. Outside, somewhere in the distance, the truck had stopped reversing. The fan hummed. The world continued in its ordinary way, entirely unaware that Elena Voss was sitting on the concrete floor of Bay 14 in Building C of a self-storage facility on a gray Tuesday afternoon, reading a document that was changing the entire shape of everything she thought she knew about her life and her father and the meaning of the cabinet she had refused to throw away. She had not yet read the note in its entirety. She had not yet opened the sealed documents or examined the framed certificates. She had not yet turned the key in all the locks that her father had left unlocked for her. But already, in the changed air of that space, she understood that whatever lay ahead of her was not going to be simple, and that it was not going to be fast, and that it was going to require her to be steady in the way she was only ever steady when things were very large indeed. She took a long, slow breath. She picked up the document again. She began from the beginning to read. The first document she had pulled from the box was a portfolio statement. Not a simple bank statement, not the kind of thing you received in a paper envelope each month with a toll-free number printed at the bottom and a one-page summary of modest figures. This was the kind of document produced by institutions that did not advertise, the kind whose letterhead carried a crest and an address in a city known more for its banking laws than its tourism, printed on paper that was heavier and smoother than ordinary paper, in the way that serious money has always distinguished itself from ordinary money through the materials it chooses to occupy. The institution's name was Helvetian Private Asset Management, with an address in Zurich, and the statement was addressed to H.V. Holdings, care of a legal firm in the Cayman Islands, whose name she did not recognize. She had stared at the figures for a long time before she accepted that she was reading them correctly. Her mind had done what minds do when confronted with numbers that exceed their frame of reference. It had tried to reduce them, to find the decimal point that would restore them to manageable proportions. But there was no misplaced decimal. The figures were what they were. The portfolio summary line at the bottom of the second page, the one labeled Total Assets Under Management, as of the most recent quarterly valuation, read $267,412,000. Elena sat on the concrete floor of Bay 14 with that number in the center of her vision and did not move for what felt like a very long time. Outside the open door of the unit, the parking area was quiet. A bird moved somewhere in the chain-link fence with a small metallic sound. The climate control fan above her head continued its steady, indifferent hum. The world maintained its usual velocity with complete unawareness that she had just read a number that was reordering everything inside her. She set the portfolio statement down and picked up the next document, then the next. She worked through the box methodically, which was the only way she knew how to work through anything, and with each document a new dimension of the picture emerged. There were holding statements from 3 separate private investment accounts across 2 countries. There were certificates of ownership for a commodity position in agricultural futures that had been held for 11 years and had grown substantially in that time. There were correspondence files from a legal trust established in 1997, in which her father was listed as sole grantor, and she herself was listed in a document dated 7 years ago, as sole beneficiary upon the grantor's death. She read that sentence twice. Sole beneficiary upon the grantor's death. Her name, Elena Marie Voss, in a document she had never seen, prepared by a lawyer she had never heard of, filed in a jurisdiction she had never thought about, written in the precise clinical language of instruments designed to transfer wealth across the distance of a life. She opened a second box. This one held correspondence, actual letters, printed on office paper and filed in chronological order, with a care that told her these had been referred to often. The letters were between her father and the legal firm in the Cayman Islands, and between her father and Helvetian Private Asset Management, and between her father and a series of specialists, including an appraiser at a London auction house, whose firm she recognized from a documentary she had watched once about the rare instrument trade. She did not read every letter in full. She could not have absorbed them all in a single sitting, and she was already aware of the limits of what she could process in this space, in this light, in this particular state of rearrangement. But she read enough. She read enough to understand that this had not been built quickly or by accident. The earliest correspondence she found was dated 1994. She had been 3 years old. Her father had been 36, working at a shipping company where he managed logistics for container freight, a job he had held for 22 years and from which he had retired quietly, and with a small party attended by colleagues who had known him for most of their working lives, and a watch and a card that said, "Harold, it won't be the same without you in the handwriting of someone who meant it." She read a letter from 1998. It described the completion of the legal trust structure and confirmed the establishment of the Cayman Islands entity. Her father had written a reply in his own hand, a copy of which was filed behind the original. It was brief. He had thanked the lawyers for their work. He had confirmed the beneficiary designation. He had added one sentence at the bottom, outside the formal structure of the letter, written slightly smaller than the rest, as if it were a note to himself that had found its way onto the page. He had written, "She will know what to do with it when the time comes." I have never doubted this. Elena sat with that sentence for a long time. The fan hummed. The bird had gone from the chain-link fence, and now there was no sound from outside at all. She thought about her father in 1998. She had been 7 years old, the same age Mia was now. She had been in 2nd grade, learning long division and growing too fast for her shoes, and her father had been sitting in a lawyer's office in a city she had never heard of, building something with her name at the center of it, and he had written, "She will know what to do with it when the time comes," in his small, precise hand, and he had filed the copy in a metal box in a storage unit behind a false panel in a cabinet that he had oiled once a year for 2 decades, and he had never said a word. She thought about the kitchen afternoons, the green armchair, the records turning, the look he gave her when she came into the room, not quite a smile, but the thing adjacent to a smile that was particular to him. She thought about the utility bills she had been not opening. She thought about the button on Mia's coat that she had not yet sewn back on. She thought about the black dress from her college graduation, and the 3 days without pay, and the particular quality of the tightness in her chest on mornings when the numbers were loudest. She thought about Patricia's email saying that the records were unlikely to hold any significant value. She thought about the estate attorney's listing, item 47, estimated resale value negligible. She did not cry. She had learned, over the last several years, the particular discipline of not crying when things were large, because large things required all available resources, and crying used some of them. She breathed. She stacked the letters carefully back in their box. She surveyed the shelves around her. There were 14 boxes on the shelves, and she had opened 2 of them, and the sum she had encountered in just those 2 was already sufficient to remake every dimension of her current life several times over. She picked up her phone and checked the time. She had been in the storage unit for 47 minutes. Patricia would be expecting her back at the house. Mia would be in the garden with the bugs, contented for now, but approaching the outer edge of the attention span that sustained independent occupation in a 7-year-old. She needed to go. She needed to pick up her daughter and return to her father's house and move through the rest of that day in the practical, functional way she moved through all days, while carrying this knowledge inside her the way you carry something fragile, with constant unconscious adjustment for its weight and vulnerability. She stood up. She looked at the shelves one more time, slowly, from left to right. The boxes with their neat labels, the files in their proper order, the climate-controlled air that her father had been paying for. She now understood. To preserve this precisely. To keep these documents stable and legible for the day when she would come and read them. She pulled the rolling door down and locked it. She held the key in her hand for a moment, feeling its weight. Then she put it in the inside pocket of her jacket and drove back to her father's house. The afternoon at the house passed in a sustained exercise of normalcy. Elena helped Patricia catalog the kitchen contents. She answered Ms. Feld's questions about the disposition of the furniture with the measured tone of a woman managing a practical task rather than the interior upheaval of someone who had just read a document that changed the fundamental mathematics of her life. Derek carried boxes to the hallway. Mia found a potato bug in the garden and spent 40 minutes attempting to establish a relationship with it before it retreated under a stone. Ms. Feld completed her inventory, made her recommendations, expressed her condolences with professional warmth, and left. The white sedan reversed out of the driveway and was gone. It was Patricia who noticed something. Patricia noticed things the way some people hear music, with a specific, involuntary attunement that bypassed deliberate observation and simply registered. She had been noticing things about Elena for 41 years, with the particular alertness of a woman who had watched her brother raise a daughter alone and had stood slightly outside that process, close enough to care and not quite close enough to intervene, always watching. She came into the back room where Elena was sealing the last of the boxes and stood in the doorway in the fading afternoon light and looked at her niece with the measured consideration of someone who is deciding how directly to ask a question. "You were gone for a while earlier," she said. "I had to check on something," Elena said. "Something Harold mentioned? Something I found." Patricia was quiet for a moment. In the hallway, Derek was carrying the last of the labeled boxes to his truck. The sounds of the house settling into its final vacancy moved through the walls like water finding its level. "Elena," Patricia said, in the tone she reserved for things she considered important. "I want you to know that whatever you found, whatever Harold left, you don't need to manage it alone. I know things have been difficult. I know the last few years have been." She stopped. Elena recognized the pause. It was the place where Patricia always paused, at the threshold between practical competence and the thing she found harder to navigate, which was the tender and imprecise territory of other people's inner lives. "I know," Elena said. "I'll let you know when I understand it better myself." Patricia nodded. She accepted this because she was that kind of person, because she trusted her niece's capability, and because she knew the difference between withholding and processing. She came forward and held Elena's hands briefly the way she had in the entryway that morning. A firm, brief, direct contact that said what she could not quite say in sentences. And then she went back to being practical, which was her most fluent language. That evening, after the drive home and the stop for lunch that became an early dinner, because neither of them had eaten much during the day, after Mia was bathed and read to and settled under her covers with the drawing book and a flashlight, and the quiet, ongoing, creative life of a 7-year-old who did not yet know that the material world had just shifted irrevocably around her, Elena sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and wrote down everything she had seen in the storage unit. She wrote down the names of institutions and the names of the legal entities and the figures she had read and the dates from the correspondence and the sentence her father had written about her at the bottom of the 1998 letter. She wrote it all out in her own handwriting, in a way that was partly documentation and partly a way of making it real, of grounding it in the physical world of ink and paper so that it could not dissolve back into the category of things that might have been misread. When she had written everything she could remember, she sat back and looked at the page. The notepad was from the veterinary clinic, printed with a small logo and the clinic's address at the top, which struck her as both mundane and fitting, on the ordinary paper of an ordinary life receiving the outline of something very far from ordinary. She thought about what needed to happen next, not the long version of next, not the question of what $267 million meant for the rest of her life, because that question was too large to approach directly and would require time and guidance and a steadiness she would have to build toward. She thought about the immediate next, what needed to happen in the following days to understand what she had found and to understand it accurately before she said anything to anyone, before the shape of this changed everything about the way her family and her world related to her. She needed verification. She needed to understand whether the documents were current and valid, whether the accounts were active, whether the trust had transferred properly, whether the legal structures her father had built were sound. She needed a professional she could trust to tell her what she was looking at, without selling her something or taking advantage of the fact that she was a woman sitting across from a desk with a notepad from a veterinary clinic. She needed to know, before she allowed herself to feel the full weight of it, that she had not misread the decimal point. She knew one person, her college roommate's older sister, who had gone into estate and trust law and had a practice in the city. They had met twice at her roommate's events and had talked for long enough on both occasions to establish the kind of respect that comes from two people recognizing in each other a way of being in the world that they share. Her name was Caroline Marsh, and Elena had her card in the drawer under the kitchen counter, because she had put it there years ago on the theory that it was the kind of card you kept, even if you never needed it. The way you keep the number of a locksmith against the future. She found the card. She wrote the name on her notepad. She would call in the morning. She slept better than she expected, which told her something about the difference between the tightness of scarcity and the weight of uncertainty. Both were uncomfortable, but they were uncomfortable in different ways. And the weight of uncertainty was, she discovered, something she could rest under in a way the tightness of scarcity never allowed. Caroline Marsh's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown that smelled of climate-controlled certainty, on the kind of building that had been designed to communicate stability through its materials and proportions. The reception area had chairs that were comfortable without being inviting, a distinction that spoke to the nature of the conversations that happened inside. Elena arrived 7 minutes early, which was the only way she arrived at things that mattered, and was shown into a conference room where she sat and looked out at the city and thought about nothing in particular until Caroline came in. Caroline Marsh was 43, compact and precise in her movements, in the way of people who think quickly and have learned to move at the same speed as their thoughts. She had the kind of face that defaulted to careful attention rather than expression, which Elena found immediately reassuring. She shook Elena's hand and sat across from her and said, without preamble, "Tell me what you found," Elena told her. She had spent the previous evening organizing the information on her notepad into a sequence she could present clearly and without emotional color, because emotional color would slow the process, and she needed the process to be fast. She described the cabinet, the false panel, the key and the note, the storage unit and its contents. She described the portfolio statement from Helvetian Private Asset Management and the figure it contained. She described the legal trust and the beneficiary designation. She described the correspondence files and the dates they spanned and the names of the institutions involved. She placed her notepad on the table between them, and Caroline read through it once without speaking. So then Caroline asked several questions. They were specific, technical questions about the form of the documents, about whether the accounts were denominated in a single currency or multiple, about the form of the trust instrument, about whether she had found any indication of when the beneficiary designation was most recently updated. Elena answered each question with what she knew and acknowledged clearly when she did not know. Caroline listened and made notes of her own and did not react to the figure with anything visible on her face, which Elena respected because it told her Caroline was doing her job rather than performing astonishment. At the end of the questions, Caroline sat back and was quiet for a moment. "I want to be careful about what I tell you at this stage," she said. "You've described what sounds like a well-structured private wealth arrangement with several components that are each, individually, a known and legitimate form of asset holding. The Swiss private bank you named is real and reputable. The Cayman trust structure you've described is a standard high net worth estate planning instrument. The legal firm that handled the trust correspondence is a firm I recognize. None of what you've described sounds irregular. What I can't tell you yet is whether all the components are current and active, and whether the transfer of the trust to you upon your father's death has been properly triggered. How long will it take to find out if the documentation is as organized as you're describing? And if the institutions are responsive, I would expect a preliminary picture within 2 weeks. A full picture within 6 to 8 weeks. Elena nodded. What should I do in the meantime? Don't talk to anyone about this. Not family, not friends. Not until we have verification. Caroline's voice was not unkind, but it was unambiguous. The reason for this is not secrecy. The reason is that until we verify the assets and the transfer, you don't actually know what you have. And once you've told people, you cannot untell them. The information changes every room you walk into, and it changes how people look at you, and it changes some of the people themselves. Give yourself the time to understand what this is before it becomes something public." Elena looked at her. She was thinking about Patricia's hands holding hers. She was thinking about Derek, with his roll of tape dismantling the bookshelf with the focused indifference of a man who preferred tasks to conversations. She was thinking about the email that said, "Estimated resale value negligible." "All right," she said. She left Caroline's office with a list of documents to retrieve from the storage unit and bring in for scanning. She walked back to her car through the city's mid-morning foot traffic, carrying her notepad and her father's key, and she felt the particular quality of a woman who has been given a task she knows how to do, which was the closest thing to comfort she had access to at this particular moment. She was good at tasks. She was good at the methodical, sequential handling of things. It was how she had survived the last several years, not by addressing everything at once, but by identifying the next thing and doing it. The next thing was the storage unit. She went back the following morning, early before work, with a portable scanner she had borrowed from the clinic without explaining why, and she spent 3 hours in Bay 14 working through the 14 boxes on the shelves with the systematic care that the situation required. She photographed and scanned every document in every box. She cataloged what she found in a spreadsheet she created on her phone, noting document type, date, institution, and any account or reference numbers visible. As she worked, the picture assembled itself with increasing clarity, and she began to understand not just the size of what her father had built, but the shape of it, its architecture, the logic of how its different parts connected. The Swiss portfolio was the largest component. It contained a diversified mix of equity holdings, bond instruments, and alternative investments that had been under active management since 2001, when the account was first funded through a transfer from an earlier private account, whose origin she found described in a document from 1999. The origin of the capital was a sale. Her father had sold a collection. The document described it only briefly, referring to the complete disposal of the V collection per the agreement dated March 1999. But the sale price and the buyer's name were listed, and the buyer was a name she recognized. She had seen it on a plaque outside a gallery in the city's arts district. The gallery bore the name of a family that had been collecting art and instruments for 4 generations. The sale price listed in the 1999 document was $41 million. Elena sat with this fact. Her father had sold a collection of something to a gallery family for $41 million in 1999, and he had then placed the proceeds into a private Swiss account under an entity name. And he had managed and grown those proceeds for the following 2 decades through the same careful, meticulous, unhurried process he applied to everything he did. And the 41 million had become 267 million. And he had maintained his house with its fading paint and its wild garden and his particular tea and his record cabinet and his annual application of beeswax throughout all of it. And he had kept the radio on during breakfast and retired with a watch and a card and not a single observable indication that any of this existed. She needed to know about the collection. There was nothing in the storage unit that described what the V collection had consisted of before the sale. Nothing that laid out its components or explained how it had been assembled. The 1999 sale document was a final summary, an end point. Whatever had preceded it, whatever it had been, was not in these boxes. She drove to the gallery. The Whitfield Collection, as the gallery was formerly known, occupied a converted industrial building in the Arts District with large north-facing windows and a smell of polished concrete and institutional calm. A young man at the reception desk with small glasses and the careful aesthetic of someone who worked somewhere that expected a certain aesthetic looked up when she entered and asked how he could help in a tone that managed to be simultaneously welcoming and slightly appraising. She asked whether there was someone available who might be able to answer a historical question about an acquisition the gallery had made in 1999. The young man's expression shifted slightly toward the mode of cautious interest that reception staff adopt when a question falls outside the territory of routine inquiry. He asked for her name. She gave it. He asked her to wait and disappeared through a door that led to the gallery's administrative interior. She stood in the entry space, looking at the walls. The current exhibition was a collection of early 20th century European works, landscapes and interiors, the kind that carried an atmosphere of deliberate quiet in their surfaces, paint applied to make the air in a room feel dense with time. She found herself thinking about her father looking at art. She had never seen him do this, or she had never noticed him doing it, which she was beginning to understand was a different thing. A woman emerged from the administrative door. She was in her early 60s, with white hair cut close and a way of moving that suggested she had worked in the presence of significant things for a long time and had developed the particular calm of someone who has learned to hold value lightly. Her name was Margaret Whitfield. The gallery bore her family's name. "Miss Voss," she said, "when my assistant mentioned your name, I wanted to come speak with you myself. Please come in." They sat in a small, comfortable office, whose walls held photographs and framed letters, alongside 3 drawings that Elena recognized as preliminary sketches for works she had seen reproduced in books. Margaret Whitfield looked at Elena with the directness of someone with no appetite for indirect approaches. "Your father was Harold Voss," she said. It was a statement, not a question. "Yes, I knew him. Not well, but I knew who he was. We met several times over the course of the acquisition negotiations. He was one of the most methodical people I have ever sat across a table from." Elena looked at her. "What did he sell you?" Margaret Whitfield folded her hands on the desk and took a breath with the quality of someone preparing to describe something that still commanded a kind of reverence, even 25 years later. "Your father had assembled, over approximately 20 years, one of the most significant private collections of pre-war European stringed instruments in existence." She paused, allowing the sentence to settle. Violins primarily, though there were violas and 2 cellos as well. Instruments that had survived the war in various ways, through hiding, through smuggling, through the ordinary miracle of individual human decisions made under impossible pressure. Some had belonged to musicians of significant historical importance. Several had documentation tracing their provenance through centuries of ownership. 2 were instruments of the kind that, when they appear on the market at all, make the international instrument community pay very close attention. She looked at Elena steadily. Your father found them in the years after the war, through his work in shipping logistics, through a network of contacts he developed over time, through a combination of knowledge and patience, and a willingness to move carefully rather than quickly. He did not collect for display. He collected for preservation. When he finally sold the collection to us, it was on the condition that the instruments would be played. He was very particular about that. He wanted them played. Elena sat with this for a moment. She thought about her father in the back room, the records, the way he held the needle above the vinyl with a quality of attention she had always admired, without quite understanding, the way he listened with his whole body still, and his eyes not seeing the room, but hearing something past it. Did he talk about why he kept the collection private? She asked. Margaret Whitfield's expression moved through something that was not quite a smile, but held the memory of one. He told me once that he had built a life in which no one expected anything complicated of him, and he had found that this was very useful. He said that the work of keeping something valuable required the freedom to make quiet decisions, and that quiet decisions were harder to make if people were watching. She paused. He also told me that everything he had built was for his daughter, and that he trusted her to know what to do with it when the time came. Elena pressed her lips together. She recognized the sentence. She had read it before. "Thank you," she said. She drove home. She sat in the parking lot of her building for a while with the engine off. The sky above the apartment complex was the same gray it had been on the morning the notification arrived, low and white and uncommitted to arriving fully. She thought about 20 years. She thought about a man in his mid-30s in the logistics department of a shipping company, developing a network of contacts through the unremarkable daily work of moving containers across oceans, finding things that other people had lost or hidden or forgotten, understanding what they were worth, acquiring them quietly, preserving them carefully, building something with his daughter's name at the center and no one watching. She thought about the particular kind of love that expresses itself not in declarations, but in decades of patient, invisible work. She had always known he loved her. She had known it the way you know the weight of a familiar room, without measuring by feel. She had not known the scale of what that love had been building in the years between her afternoons, in the green armchair, and this particular gray day, in the parking lot of a building with a broken elevator. She went upstairs. She made coffee. She called Caroline Marsh and told her about the gallery visit and the instrument collection and the 1999 sale. Caroline listened and asked her additional questions, and then said, in her careful, measured way, that this was very helpful context, and that she would be in contact once the initial verification had progressed. The following 10 days were the strangest Elena had lived. She went to work at the veterinary clinic. She made Mia's lunches. She sewed the button back on the coat. She opened the utilities bill and paid it from the account she had been managing by the narrow margin that required constant minor calculation. Because nothing had changed yet. The verification was in progress. The assets had not transferred, and she was still a woman with a part-time job and a daughter in a one-bedroom apartment with a broken elevator and the particular tightness in her chest that lived at the intersection of love and insufficient money. The knowledge she was carrying changed nothing about the material facts of her current life. But it changed the quality of how she moved through those facts. The way that knowing rain will eventually stop does not make you less wet, but does change the way you stand in it. Patricia called twice. Both times the calls were practical and warm, and carried somewhere in their undertow the question Patricia was not quite asking, the one Elena had promised she would answer when she understood it better herself. Elena answered what was practical and let the undertow pass without addressing it, and Patricia, who was wise enough to let things come in their time, allowed this. It was on the 11th day that Caroline Marsh called. Elena was in the back office of the veterinary clinic, between appointments, eating a sandwich she had mostly forgotten was in her hand, when her phone lit up with Caroline's name. "I have preliminary verification," Caroline said. Her voice had the quality it had in the conference room, careful, measured, doing the job without performing. "The Swiss account is active. The trust instrument was properly executed, and the transfer on death designation is valid and current under Swiss and Cayman law. The assets are yours, Elena, all of them. The total verified current value is $267,412,000 as of last quarter's valuation, and the underlying portfolio has performed well this year, so the current figure is likely higher." Elena set down the sandwich. "There is no ambiguity?" she asked. "None. Your father was a meticulous man. The documentation is extremely clean. There are no competing claims, no other beneficiaries, no legal irregularities. It is a straightforward inheritance of a well-structured private estate. It will take several months to fully transfer everything into your name and into domestic accounts, if that is your preference, but the claim is not in question." Elena looked at the wall of the back office, which had a poster about feline dental health, and a corkboard pinned with appointment reminders, and the photo of a staff member's recent vacation to a national park. "All right," she said. She talked with Caroline for another 20 minutes about the practical next steps, the filings, the timelines, the decisions about domestic versus international asset management that would need to be made eventually, but didn't need to be made immediately. When the call ended, she sat for a moment in the stillness of the back office and did the thing she had not done in the storage unit, or in the conference room, or in the gallery, or in the parking lot. She allowed the size of it to arrive, fully, without management. The whole unfiltered weight of what her father had built, and what it meant, what it had always meant. The decades of silent, dedicated work that had been directed at her from before she was old enough to understand the concept of a legacy. The love that expressed itself not in words, but in $41 million grown patiently to $267 million across 24 years of unhurried, invisible care. She pressed her hand over her eyes. Her breath came differently for a few moments. Not crying exactly, but the nearest thing to it that her particular discipline allowed. A brief, private surrender to the magnitude of what had happened, to the strange, profound grief of being loved at a scale she had never known, by a man who had died before she could tell him that she understood. The afternoon light coming through the small window of the back office fell across the floor in a pale, oblique line. The clinic was quiet around her. The world outside continued in its ordinary way. She thought about the record cabinet. Item 47. Estimated resale value negligible. She thought about the moment she had said, "I'll keep the cabinet," with a finality that closed the subject the way a door closes, simply pulled shut. She thought about not knowing why she needed to keep it, only knowing that she did, the same way she had always known certain things about her father, without needing to be told, by feel, by the quality of the room when he was in it. She took her hand from her eyes. She picked up the sandwich. She ate the rest of it, because she still had 2 appointments this afternoon, and she needed to be functional, which was the version of ready she had always been practicing. Then she picked up her phone and sent Caroline a message, confirming she had received the information and was ready to proceed with the next steps. She did not call Patricia that night. She had promised when she understood it better herself, and she was not yet there. The understanding was real now, verified and documented, and legally confirmed, but she had not yet found the words to bring it out of the category of her own interior landscape and into the world where it would change everything about the rooms she walked into and the way some of the people in them looked at her. She was thinking about how to do that, about what she owed to honesty and to the people who had thought they knew what her life was and would need to revise that understanding, and about Patricia's hands holding hers, about Derek with his tape, about the email that had said the most efficient course of action would be donation and disposal, about the estate attorney's representative with her clipboard and her professional equanimity around the artifacts of other people's lives. She thought about item 47, about negligible. She thought about her father, who had been a quiet man, and about the way that quiet men sometimes say the loudest things. She put Mia to bed. She sat in the kitchen with her coffee and her notepad and the utilities bill she had already paid. And she began, for the first time since the Saturday that had started all of this, to think about what came next. Not the verification, not the legal transfer, not the practical machinery of moving wealth from one set of structures to another. She thought about what came after all of that, about who she wanted to be in possession of this, about what her father had meant when he wrote she will know what to do with it when the time comes, about whether she was ready to be that version of herself, the one who knew what to do. She was not ready yet, but she was closer than she had been. And she had her father's key in her jacket pocket, and her name in his handwriting on a folded piece of paper, and $267 million waiting in the structures he had built for her with the patience of a man who had never been in a hurry because he had always known she would come. She closed the notepad. She turned off the kitchen light. She stood in the dark apartment for a moment, listening to the sounds Mia made in her sleep, small movements and soft breaths, the sound of a child dreaming without knowledge of the world shifting around her. Outside the window, the city moved in its usual rhythms, lights and traffic, and the low hum of everything continuing. Elena thought, "I'll know what to do." She did not yet know exactly what that meant, but she felt, for the first time in a very long time, the tightness in her chest ease by a fraction. Not gone, not solved, but loosened, as though whatever had been, wound tightest inside her, had found, in the knowledge of what her father had built, a small but definite amount of slack. It was enough. For tonight, it was enough. The call to Patricia came on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the Saturday at the house. Elena had decided, with the same methodical care she brought to everything that mattered, that she would not tell the story in pieces. She would not hint at it over the phone or send an email that required a follow-up or allow the information to arrive in fragments that could be misread or magnified in the wrong directions before she was present to provide context. She would tell Patricia in person, and she would tell her the whole of it, from the cabinet to the false panel to the storage unit to the gallery, to Caroline Marsh's call from the back office of the veterinary clinic. She would tell it as a story, beginning to end, because it was a story, and stories deserve to be told in full. She asked Patricia to come for dinner on Thursday, just the two of them. She said she had something to tell her about her father, and that it was not bad news, but it was significant, and she wanted to tell it properly. Patricia said she would be there at 6. Elena made dinner. She made the pasta dish her father had made for them both on winter evenings when Elena was a teenager, a simple thing with olive oil and garlic and herbs from the window box he kept on the kitchen ledge. And she had written down the recipe once from memory, and it was not quite right, but it was close enough that the smell of it, while it was cooking, had the quality of the thing it was trying to be. She set the table with the plates she used for occasions and poured 2 glasses of wine and waited. Patricia arrived at 6 exactly, which was how Patricia arrived everywhere, and she came in with the slightly braced quality of someone who has told herself not to pre-decide what she is about to hear, which was one of Patricia's better skills, and Elena had always respected it. She sat at the table and looked at the pasta and the wine, and at Elena's face, and said, "Tell me." Elena told her. From the beginning. She told it the way she had told Caroline Marsh, without emotional color, with sequence and specificity, and the occasional pause to allow the details to settle before adding the next layer. She described the cabinet and the brass handles, and the lower doors she had opened while the estate was being sorted. She described the way the back panel's grain was too regular, how she had pressed the lower left corner, how the panel had opened with the dry sound of something that had not been touched in a long time. She described the hidden shelf and its contents, and the small metal box, and the key, and the note with her name in her father's handwriting on the outside. Patricia said nothing, so her hands were flat on the table, and she was listening with the whole of herself, the way she listened when something was too large for her usual economical attention. Elena described the storage unit, and the 14 boxes, and the portfolio statement from Helvetian Private Asset Management, and the figure at the bottom of the second page. She described the legal trust, and the beneficiary designation. She described the correspondence spanning 24 years. She described Margaret Whitfield and the gallery, and the pre-war stringed instruments, and her father developing a network through his logistics work, finding things that had survived the war and were worth preserving, on building a collection that he had sold in 1999 for $41 million, and then managed quietly and patiently until it had become $267 million. She described Caroline Marsh's call and the words, "The assets are yours, Elena." When she finished, the room was very quiet. The pasta had gone slightly cold. Patricia's wineglass was still full. For a long moment, Patricia looked at the table. Then she looked at Elena. Her expression was doing several things at once, the way faces do when they are processing something for which they do not have an existing category. There was disbelief, not the dismissive kind, but the genuine kind. The kind that comes not from skepticism, but from the sheer cognitive distance between what you expected to hear and what you heard. There was a kind of grief, and the particular grief of realizing how much of another person remained unknown to you even after a lifetime of proximity. And there was something else, something that arrived slowly and settled last, a deep, quiet recognition. "She loved your father," Patricia said finally. Her voice was careful, the way you handle something you do not want to break. I thought I knew him. I thought I understood the shape of him. I thought he was a simple man who had made a simple life and was content with it. She stopped. "He was content with it," Elena said. "That was real." Patricia nodded. She picked up her wineglass and held it without drinking. "He was the most private person I have ever known," she said. "But I always thought private meant contained. I never thought it meant this." There was a longer silence. Elena refilled the wine, and they sat with it, with the pasta and the quiet kitchen and the weight of what had been said. And it was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that forms between two people who have just understood something together, something that was true before they understood it and will continue to be true after the understanding, but that has nonetheless changed something about how they will carry it going forward. "Do you know what you're going to do?" Patricia asked. "I'm starting to," Elena said. Patricia nodded again. She looked at her niece across the table with an expression that had resolved into something simple and clear. "He was right about you," she said. Elena looked at her. "In 1998, whatever he wrote in that letter, he was right. You did know what to do." She reached across and touched Elena's hand briefly. The same brief contact as in the hallway of the house, firm and direct and saying what sentences couldn't quite reach. Then she picked up her fork and said, "The pasta's good, by the way." Elena laughed. It was a short laugh, slightly unsteady. the kind that comes out when relief and grief and gratitude arrive simultaneously in a space too small to hold them separately. But it was real, and Patricia smiled at the sound of it, and they ate their dinner. The conversation with Derek was shorter and less warm, and no less necessary. Elena called him the following week, after she had spoken to Caroline Marsh again about the transfer timeline, after she had begun to understand the practical shape of the coming months, with enough clarity to answer the questions she knew he would ask. Derek was not a complicated man, so he was practical in a way that was adjacent to Patricia's practicality, but without its warmth, and his first response to the information was silence, followed by a question about whether the estate had been properly notarized, followed by a second question about whether she had consulted with more than one legal professional. She told him she had engaged one of the most respected estate and trust attorneys in the city, that the verification had been thorough, and the documentation was clean, that her father had been, as anyone who knew him would have predicted, meticulous in every aspect of how this had been structured. There was a pause on Derek's end of the line that she recognized as the pause of a man adjusting his understanding of a situation, recalibrating the assumptions he had walked in with. He said, and his voice was not unkind, "I told Patricia that cabinet wasn't worth the cost of moving it." "I know," Elena said. Another pause. "Well," he said finally, "it seems I was wrong about that." "Yes," Elena said. "You were." She said it without cruelty and without triumph, because neither was warranted and neither was what she felt. What she felt was closer to the quiet accuracy of a corrected record, a fact returned to its true form after a period of misrepresentation. She did not feel the need to make him feel it more sharply than he already did. She had not refused to throw away the cabinet in order to prove something to Derek, or to Patricia, or to the estate attorney's representative with her clipboard and her figure of negligible. She had refused because of something she could not have explained at the time, and could now describe only as the particular frequency of her father's care for that piece of furniture. The decades of beeswax, the alphabetized rose, the oiled wood, the way certain kinds of love announce themselves not in declarations, but in the sustained quality of attention paid to what they contain. Derek asked, before he hung up, whether there was anything he could do to help with the process. She thanked him and said she would let him know. She believed, and was later proven right, that this would be the extent of his engagement with the subject. He would adjust, as practical men do, to the new shape of things, and he would continue to be someone she saw at funerals and holiday dinners, now carrying a slightly different understanding of her and a slightly different relationship with what he had almost thrown away. It was the estate attorney's firm that provided, without intending to, the most pointed moment of reckoning. Caroline Marsh had recommended that Elena inform the estate attorney formally that the record cabinet was being retained and removed from the disposition plan, and that the documentation for this be filed and confirmed. Elena did this through a brief letter drafted with Caroline's assistance, and the response came from Ms. Feld, the young woman with the tablet and the clipboard, in the form of a brief email that was professional in tone and entirely routine in its language, acknowledging the change and updating the inventory record for Item 47. Item 47. So estimated resale value negligible. Elena read the email and sat with it for a moment. She was not angry. She had never been angry at Ms. Feld, who had been doing her job with professional competence and no particular malice. The estate attorney's job was to appraise what was visible, and what was visible was an aging piece of oak furniture with a collection of decades-old vinyl records. The invisible things, the false panel, and the hidden shelf, and the key, and the note with her name, and the 24 years of patient accumulation were not part of the inventory, because they had not been part of what was presented to be inventoried. This was the nature of secrets kept well. They remained invisible to every eye except the one they were intended for. She wrote back acknowledging receipt and thanking Ms. Seefeld for her work throughout the process. Then she closed the laptop and went to pick up Mia from school. The practical unfolding of the following months proceeded with the particular pace of significant financial transactions, which was slower than urgency would have preferred, but faster than doubt would have suggested. Caroline Marsh navigated the international transfer structures with competence and clarity, managing the communication between the Cayman Legal Trust, the Swiss private bank, and the domestic financial institutions that would eventually hold Elena's assets. There were documents to sign. There were decisions to make about investment strategy and asset management. There were conversations with financial advisors and tax specialists that Elena approached with the same methodical attention she had applied to the storage unit and the document boxes, reading carefully, asking questions when she did not understand, never pretending to knowledge she did not have. She did not rush. Her father had not rushed. The estate of a man who had spent 24 years building something this carefully deserved to be received at a pace consistent with how it had been made. She allowed herself the time to understand each component before moving to the next, to ask what each decision meant, not just for the immediate transaction, but for the long structure of how she wanted to live and what she wanted to do. These were not questions she had ever had occasion to ask before, and she found them, initially, slightly vertiginous in their openness, the way a wide landscape can be disorienting after years in a narrow corridor. But the vertigo settled as she spent time with the questions, as she developed the language for the answers, as she understood more clearly what it was she valued and what it was she wanted to protect. She quit her job at the veterinary clinic on a Wednesday, giving 3 weeks' notice with a letter that thanked her colleagues genuinely for the work they had shared, because they had been good colleagues and the work had been honest work, and she was not a person who left things without gratitude. Her supervisor, a quiet woman named Dr. Okafor, who had hired her during the difficult period after the marriage ended, and had been, without making a demonstration of it, a source of consistent, reliable decency throughout, unhugged her in the hallway outside the supply room and said she hoped whatever was next was wonderful. Elena said she believed it would be. The apartment was the first practical change she made once the initial transfer was complete. She found a place 3 months after the storage unit, in a building in a part of the city she had always passed through on other errands and had looked at through the window of buses and taxis with the mild, habitual appreciation of someone considering something they are not considering seriously. It had 2 bedrooms and a kitchen with a window that looked over a courtyard where a single large tree grew with the well-established authority of something that had been there long before the building and expected to remain long after. It had working elevators, so it had the particular quality of a home waiting to receive the particular family that would make sense of it. Mia walked through it for the first time on a Saturday morning, still in the coat with the button that had by this point been sewn back on for several months, and she moved through each room with the focused exploratory attention of a child assessing a space for its imaginative possibilities. She stood at the window of what would be her room and looked at the courtyard and the tree and reported, with great seriousness, that she could see at least 3 different kinds of birds from here, and that this was a very good sign. Elena stood in the doorway behind her and watched her daughter at the window and felt something she had not had access to in a very long time, a sensation that she identified, with some surprise at the simplicity of the word for it, as ease. Not happiness exactly, though happiness was present. Not relief exactly, though that was there too. Ease, the quality of a life that has enough room in it, the feeling of a chest in which the tightness has finally, fully, resolved. She sat down on the floor of the empty room because it was the only seating available, and because she had developed, over the years, a habit of sitting on floors when things were too large for chairs, and she looked at her daughter, at the window, watching the birds. and she thought about her father in his green armchair, listening to records. And she understood something that she had not quite articulated before. The similarity was not incidental. The quality of attention Mia brought to the birds at the window was the same quality her father had brought to the music, the same quality Elena herself had brought to the false panel in the lower cabinet, the same quality that ran like a thread through the three of them, the ability to be fully present to a thing, to give it the whole of yourself without reservation. Her father had given the whole of himself to building something for her. She had given the whole of herself to keeping a cabinet that everyone else had been ready to throw away. And now, Mia was giving the whole of herself to 3 kinds of birds in a courtyard tree, and none of it was separate from any of it. She thought, he would have liked watching her. The sadness of this was real, but it was not the raw, uncontained grief of the early weeks. It had the quality of something that had been held long enough to settle, that had found its permanent place in the architecture of her understanding. Her father was gone, and that was true, and it would always be true, and she would carry it as she carried everything, steadily and without making it the loudest thing in the room. But he had also left something behind that was not simply money. He had left evidence. He had left the entire documented record of a life lived with an extraordinarily sustained private devotion. And she had that record in 14 boxes in a climate-controlled storage unit. And she would keep it, as she had kept the cabinet, because certain things are worth keeping, not for what they represent on a balance sheet, but for what they say about the person who made them. When she enrolled Mia in a school with small class sizes and teachers who had time for questions. She had visited 4 schools before deciding, spending a morning at each, sitting in on classes, watching the way the teachers listened to the children, evaluating not the facilities or the curriculum, but the quality of attention in the rooms. She had chosen the one where the teacher sat at the child's level when a question was being asked, where the classroom smelled of paint and books rather than cleaning products, where a child's attempt at something difficult was greeted with the patience of someone who understood that the attempt was the point. On Mia's first day, she had walked in with her drawing book under her arm and the seriousness of a person embarking on a project she intended to do well, and she had not looked back. Elena did not stop there. She called Margaret Whitfield at the gallery. She told her, in the careful way she had learned to speak about large things without overstating them, that she was the daughter of Harold Voss, and that she had recently learned the full story of what her father had built and preserved and sold, and that she would like to understand more about the instruments, about where they had come from and where they were now, and whether any of them were still being played, as her father had required. Margaret Whitfield had answered this question with the warm, precise enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for it. She described, over the course of an hour, the current status of the collection. Most of the instruments were in regular use, several on loan to professional orchestras, the 2 in the possession of solo performers of international standing. 1 violin, she said, was currently being played by a musician in Vienna, whose recordings Elena would recognize. It had been made in the early 18th century and had survived the war in the lining of a coat belonging to a musician who had walked across 2 borders in the winter of 1942. Her father had found it in 1984 through a contact in Hamburg. Elena listened to this with the particular stillness of someone in the presence of something significant. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "I'd like to create a foundation," she said. "Something that continues what he was doing. Preservation. Support for musicians who need instruments. Education programs that give young people access to musical training they wouldn't otherwise have. I want it to carry his name." There was a brief pause on Margaret Whitfield's end of the line. Not hesitation, but the pause of someone allowing a moment to receive its proper weight. "I think that's exactly right," Margaret said. The Harold Voss Foundation for Musical Preservation was established 8 months after the Saturday at the House, incorporated as a non-profit, with a board that included Margaret Whitfield and 2 specialists in the preservation of rare instruments and 2 educators from programs serving underserved communities. Its founding endowment was funded from Elena's inheritance, a figure that made Caroline Marsh, who was not given to visible reactions, close her eyes briefly and nod once with the quality of someone acknowledging that certain things are simply right. Elena was the foundation's executive director. She had not planned this specifically. She had planned to hire someone for the role, someone with a background in nonprofit management and experience in the arts funding world. But in the months of planning the structure, of working with the board to define the mission and the programs and the criteria for grant-making, she had found herself doing the work with a quality of engagement she had not felt toward any work in a very long time, the same quality she had felt on the floor of the storage unit and in the gallery with Margaret Whitfield, and in every conversation that brought her closer to understanding what her father had spent his life building. She had told Caroline, with the slight surprise of someone who has found their direction by walking rather than by mapping, that she thought she would be taking the role herself. Caroline had said without surprise, and that she thought that made sense. The Foundation's first grant cycle funded 6 young musicians between the ages of 12 and 20, each from circumstances that would have made serious musical education otherwise inaccessible. They came from 3 different cities. They played violin, cello, clarinet, piano, and one played the viola, which made Elena think of her father's collection, of the violas and 2 cellos he had found and preserved alongside the violins, and she had read the viola student's application letter twice, the letter describing how she had heard a piece of music through a neighbor's window when she was 9 years old and had not been the same since. She sent the grant award letter personally. She wrote a note at the bottom in her own hand. Music is worth preserving. So are the people who make it. Welcome. So it was on the evening of the Foundation's first public event, a small recital held in the gallery's main space, that Patricia came to her with the quality of someone who has been carrying something for 8 months and has decided it is time to set it down. They were standing together at the edge of the room while a cellist named Yolanda, 17 years old, and one of the Foundation's first grant recipients, played something slow and precise and deeply felt to an audience of 40 people who had gone very quiet. "Elena," Patricia said, in the voice she used for the things she found hard, "I want to tell you something." Elena waited. "I told you to throw away the cabinet," Patricia said. "I know. I was practical about it. I made a list of reasons. I presented them as common sense." She paused. "I was wrong, not just about the cabinet. I was wrong about your father. I thought I knew him, and I didn't, and I am sorry that I didn't look closer." She turned to look at her niece. "And I want you to know that what you've done with this, with all of it, the foundation, the grants, the way you've carried it, he would have been so proud of you. He already was, but he would have been even more proud now." Elena looked at her aunt, at the familiar face that had been present at every major moment of her life, through the divorce and the difficult years and the 3 days without pay and the black dress from the college graduation. The woman who had sent the email about estimated resale value negligible with genuine kindness in the same breath. "I know," Elena said. "He told me." And for a moment they both stood with that, with the full improbable truth of it. The note in the small metal box, the folded paper with her name, the sentence about pride written by a quiet man in his particular handwriting as the permanent record of what he had never quite managed to say aloud in all the years they had sat together in the green armchair with the records turning. Across the room, Yolanda lifted her bow at the end of the phrase and let the last note of the piece dissolve slowly into the air of the gallery, the sound thinning and spreading and finally becoming indistinguishable from the silence around it. The audience did not move for a moment. Then they began to applaud, with the warm, full sound of people genuinely moved. Elena applauded too. She looked at the young woman with the cello, 17 years old, who had heard music through a neighbor's window at 9 and had not been the same since. And she thought about her father, who had found a violin in the lining of a coat in 1984 and had understood immediately what it was worth, not in money, though that came too, but in the older and more durable sense. Worth preserving, worth protecting, worth building something around so that it could continue to exist in the world. She had understood this. He had known she would. In the weeks after the recital, life continued its new and different rhythm. The foundation's operations, Mia's school, the apartment with the courtyard tree, where 3 kinds of birds visited with reliable frequency, a morning routine that no longer involved the particular tightness at the calculation of margins. She still lived methodically. She still arrived at important things 7 minutes early. She still sat on kitchen floors when events were too large for chairs, though less often now, and with a different quality of sitting, less like taking shelter and more like choosing to be close to the ground for a moment before standing up again. She went back to her father's house once more in the late spring, after the house had been formally released from the estate, and before it was transferred to the buyer. She had found, through a careful and unhurried process, a young family who had walked through the front door with a baby on one person's hip and a toddler investigating the garden with the focused attention of someone who has correctly assessed a space for its imaginative possibilities. She had known immediately. She had not been wrong. She went on a weekday morning when the house was empty. She had a key still, and she let herself in and stood in the hallway for a moment. The smell was fainter now, time and ventilation having diluted the beeswax and the tea and the particular indefinite quality of him. But it was not entirely gone. It remained in the way that certain things remain in old houses, not as scent exactly, but as something that engages the same sense by a slightly different route, a quality in the air that says this space held a life and the life left a mark. She walked to the back room. The green armchair was gone, donated to a resale shop that refurbished furniture for families in transition, which had seemed right. The low lamp was gone. The side table with its reading glasses and its book were gone. The room was empty, which gave it the particular spaciousness of a place that has been cleared without being erased, like a sentence with the words removed, but the syntax still visible. The record cabinet was not there. It was in the apartment, in the living room beside the window that looked over the courtyard tree. It held the records in their alphabetical rows, exactly as they had been, and the lower section had been left as she had found it. The false panel reachable by anyone who knew to press the lower left corner. She had left nothing inside it. The documents were in Caroline's office. The key was in her jewelry box. The note was in a small frame on her bedroom wall, next to a photograph she had found in the correspondence files. Her father at roughly 30 years old, standing outside a building she did not recognize, carrying a case of the size and shape used for stringed instruments, squinting slightly against the sun, with an expression that she had not seen in any of the photographs she had known before this one. In this one, he was smiling, fully, without the quality of restraint she associated with his face in photographs, and it was such a complete smile that it changed the shape of his entire face and made him look younger and more open and very much like someone engaged in the private joy of a person doing the exact work they were meant to do in the world. She had kept that photograph more than any other thing. She stood in the empty back room of her father's house for a few minutes. Then she did the thing she had not done in any of the previous visits. She sat down on the floor in the approximate place where the green armchair had been, and she sat with her back against the wall and looked at the empty room and listened to the house. It was quiet, the kind of quiet particular to houses awaiting the next family, a held breath, a readiness. Outside, the garden was beginning to come back into its spring disorder, which the young family's toddler would investigate with great seriousness in due course. The light coming through the window was the thin, clear light of a morning still deciding whether to be fully present. She thought about everything that had come from this room, the records and the beeswax and the afternoons of comfortable silence and the false panel in the back of the lower cabinet, the key and the note and the storage unit and 14 boxes and $267 million and the foundation and Yolanda with her cello and 6 young musicians in 3 cities who had been given the thing they needed to do the work they were meant to do. She thought about the young family coming to fill this house with the sounds of their particular life, the baby growing in these rooms, the toddler learning the garden, the maple tree in the front yard shedding its seeds onto the same cracked section of sidewalk it had been shedding them onto for 30 years. She thought about her father sitting in his green armchair while the record turned, and the look he gave her when she came in, not quite a smile, but the thing adjacent to a smile, and the particular quality of the silence between them, which had always been. She understood now, not an absence of communication, but its fullest form. She thought, I know what to do now. She sat there a while longer, the way you sit in a place that has meant something before you leave it for the last time, not extending the moment beyond what it naturally held, but allowing it to be fully what it was. Then she stood up, brushed off the back of her jeans, walked down the hallway and out the front door, and pulled it closed behind her. The maple tree was budding. The cracked sidewalk was damp from the previous night's rain. Somewhere at the end of the street, a dog was barking at something it found interesting, with the cheerful, persistent optimism of a dog that has not yet learned that the interesting thing never arrives on schedule. The world was moving in its ordinary way, and she was part of it. And she walked to her car in the spring morning with the key in her pocket and her father's smile in a frame on her bedroom wall. And she was not the same person who had stood in the driveway of this house on a gray Saturday morning 3 seasons ago, arriving at something she was not ready for. She was ready now. She was ready in the way that comes not from certainty, but from having traveled through uncertainty fully enough to know that you can bear it and move through it and come out the other side, carrying what mattered and setting down what did not. Ready in the way that comes from a 7-year-old in a coat with a sewn-back button pointing out 3 kinds of birds from a new window. Ready in the way that comes from a young woman named Yolanda, letting the last note of a cello piece dissolve into the air of a gallery, while 40 people go quiet with the particular quality of people who have received something they will carry for a long time. Ready in the way that comes from knowing that your father left you a note with your name on it, and that the note said he had always been proud of you, and that you believe it, and that you will spend the rest of your life doing something equal to the size of the love that made it. She drove back through the city in the clear spring light. She thought about the things she needed to do that afternoon: a board meeting for the foundation, a call with the education program director, picking up Mia from school. She thought about the pasta she would make for dinner, and the one from her father's recipe that was not quite right but close enough. She thought about what she would tell Mia tonight, whether it was time to begin explaining, in the way that 7-year-olds can receive explanations, something about Grandpa Harold and the cabinet and the records and what had been hidden inside it. She thought Mia would understand more than expected. Mia was that kind of person, the kind who looks carefully, the kind who notices when something is not the same as the things around it. The kind who believes that a caterpillar might reasonably prefer to become a detective rather than a butterfly, and who pursues that theory with the full commitment of someone who hasn't yet learned to regard the improbable as unworthy of investigation. Harold Voss had been that kind of person too. Elena merged onto the highway in the thin, clear spring light, the city spreading ahead of her, and she thought about preservation, about the things worth keeping, about the distance between what is visible and what is real, about the sustained, invisible work of love, about a record cabinet in a living room with a courtyard tree outside the window, holding its alphabetized rows and its hidden shelf, and the decades of careful attention paid to what it contained. About a quiet man in a green armchair who had been, the whole time, saying the loudest thing. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.